I've never believed in ghosts. I always thought it was just stories people told to scare others. But I swear, what happened to me that night in that abandoned building, it changed everything. To this day, I can't go near an old, empty structure without my heart racing and my mind spiraling back to that night. It started as a dare, a stupid dare from my friends. We were always looking for ways to one-up each other, and this time, it was about exploring the old Stanley building. You know the one, right? It's the place everyone talks about. Everyone says it's haunted, everyone says it's cursed. But I thought, who would be scared of some old rumors? The Stanley building had been abandoned for decades. Once a thriving factory, it had shut down years ago, and rumors spread about strange noises, flickering lights, and people disappearing. It was located on the outskirts of town, hidden away from sight, behind trees that grew too thick to see through. It looked like a forgotten relic of another time, with shattered windows, decaying walls, and a creeping fog always clinging to the ground. We made plans that evening about a week before Halloween. Everyone was up for it. Well, almost everyone. Sarah was the only one who hesitated, but after a bit of pressure, she joined us. I think she was more afraid of the idea of backing out than actually being scared of the place. We decided we'd go at night, because that's when the building's reputation for being haunted was the most talked about. We pulled up at around midnight. The building loomed large in the dark, like a ghost from the past. It was even worse up close. Broken windows, vines crawling up the sides, and a door that seemed like it hadn't been opened in years. The air was thick, and there was a sense of something watching us. But of course, we didn't let that stop us. We were young, cocky, and braver than we should have been. We walked in through the front door, which creaked like it hadn't moved in years. The inside of the building smelled of mildew and dust. The floor was covered with old wood and broken glass, crunching under our feet with every step. The sound of our voices echoed off the walls, which only made the silence that much more oppressive. We explored the ground floor for a while, walking through rooms that were half collapsed, where the floorboards were warped and uneven. It felt like a time capsule. Old furniture, forgotten papers, and machinery rusting away in the corner. It was eerie, but nothing we couldn't handle. That was until we found the staircase leading to the upper floors. We hesitated at first, the stairs looking unstable, but the dare was still fresh in our minds, and one by one, we decided to go up. The air grew colder as we climbed, and the darkness seemed to grow deeper the higher we went. It felt like the building was alive, breathing with us, and the longer we were in it, the more it felt like something was following us. I chalked it up to nerves. An old building like this, of course it would feel strange. On the second floor, that's when things started to feel wrong. The place was completely different from the first floor. It was darker, colder, and the silence was almost unbearable. We heard faint whispers in the distance, but none of us said anything. We didn't want to seem scared, even though we all felt it creeping into our bones. We explored a few rooms, finding nothing but old storage crates, rusted metal, and torn wallpaper. That's when I noticed something odd. At the far end of the hallway, there was a door. It was partially open, and there was a faint light coming from the crack. It was strange, because there shouldn't have been any power in the building. "Is anyone else seeing that?" I asked, my voice shaky despite my best efforts to sound confident. My friends stopped, and for the first time that night, they looked uncertain. The light was faint, but it was there. We approached slowly, our footsteps echoing in the hall as we moved closer. The door creaked as we pushed it open, revealing a small, dimly lit room. It looked like it used to be an office of some sort, but the desk was overturned, papers scattered everywhere, and the walls were covered in strange markings. The light was coming from an old lamp in the corner, flickering as though it had just been turned on. But there was something else, something that made my heart skip a beat. On the floor, in the center of the room, was a symbol. It was drawn in red, almost like blood, and it had strange runes around the edges. My skin crawled as I stared at it. I didn't know what it meant, but I could feel its presence, its power. It was wrong. "Let's go. Now," Sarah said, her voice trembling. But I couldn't move. I felt like I was rooted to the spot. I wanted to leave, but I couldn't tear my eyes away from the symbol. That's when I heard it, a soft whisper barely audible coming from behind me. "Get out!" It was a voice, low, guttural, and full of anger. I spun around, but there was nothing there, just darkness. My heart was pounding in my chest, and I could feel the sweat on my palms. We had to go. We had to leave. Let's go, I shouted, and my friends scrambled to get out of the room. We ran down the hallway, our feet stumbling as we rushed to get to the stairs. But when we reached the top of the stairs, we froze. The staircase had changed. The stairs we had climbed were gone. Instead, there was a black void, an endless abyss that stretched downward into nothing. The building had somehow shifted. The layout had changed. The exit was no longer where we had left it. Panic set in. We turned to look at each other, and that's when we heard it. Footsteps behind us. Slow, deliberate footsteps. I spun around, but no one was there. The air grew thick, oppressive, and I could feel the temperature drop even more. "Get out!" A voice growled from the darkness, its tone more menacing now. We ran. We didn't care about the building or the dare anymore. We didn't care about being brave. We just ran. I don't know how we made it out, but somehow we did. We stumbled out of the front door, gasping for breath, and didn't stop until we were back at the cars. We drove away, not looking back, and none of us said a word for the entire ride home. To this day, I have nightmares about that place. I can still hear the whispers in my ears, feel the eyes watching me from the darkness, and every time I pass by that building, I can feel the air growing colder, the ground shaking beneath me. I don't know what was in there or what we disturbed, but I know one thing for sure: some things are better left alone. Scared yet? Subscribe for more tales from the dark side that'll send shivers down your spine.
Next story.
I had always been the type of person who enjoyed urban exploration, sneaking into old, abandoned buildings and getting a thrill from the decaying walls and forgotten relics of the past. It was my hobby, my escape. That was until one night I found myself in a building that I should have never stepped foot in. A place that would change my life forever. The story begins on a Friday evening when my friends and I decided to explore an old textile mill that had been abandoned for decades. It was located in a part of town that had once been bustling but was now deserted, a shadow of its former self. We had heard rumors about the mill, strange occurrences, odd disappearances, but those stories were usually just exaggerated for thrill, I thought. We figured it would just be another night of exploring the unknown, something we'd tell our friends about later with a laugh. I met my friends, Ryan, Jess, and Mike, at a nearby diner before we headed to the mill. As we drove there, we joked about how people always seem to make up wild stories about places like this. Ghosts, creatures, shadows moving on their own. None of it seemed real. But as we got closer, a strange unease began to settle in my stomach. The mill sat on the edge of town, its towering brick walls towering in the dark, like the remnants of a forgotten empire. The closer we got, the more I began to question if it was really a good idea to be there. But it was too late to turn back. We parked our car in an overgrown lot, and by the time we got out, the air had turned cold, despite it being a warm summer night. We grabbed our flashlights and stepped through the rusted gate that barely hung on its hinges. The place looked like it had been frozen in time, the windows dark and cracked, the doors hanging on by a thread. The ground was littered with debris, and the only sound that greeted us was the soft creaking of the mill's rusting skeleton in the breeze. We made our way inside. The floors were covered in dust and old fabric, remnants of the workers' past lives. The walls were adorned with faded murals of the town's former glory, though most of them were chipped and peeling. We wandered through the halls, our footsteps echoing through the empty building. "It's just a building, guys," I said, trying to keep the mood light. But deep down, something didn't feel right. The air felt stagnant, thick with the smell of rust and decay. We moved deeper into the building, the darkness enveloping us. There were no windows here, just long, narrow hallways leading to rooms full of forgotten machinery and broken furniture. As we explored, I began to notice something strange. The building was too quiet. No wind, no distant sounds of traffic or animals, just the sound of our breathing and the crunch of our boots on the broken floor. Jess was the first to mention it. "I feel like we're not alone." I laughed it off. "It's just the silence. The building's probably settling." But Jess wasn't convinced. She kept glancing over her shoulder, her eyes darting around nervously. I figured she was just being paranoid, but there was something in the air that made me uneasy too. The deeper we ventured into the mill, the more oppressive the atmosphere became. We came across a large factory floor, dimly lit by a few weak beams of moonlight that filtered through the cracks in the ceiling. The rusted remnants of old machinery loomed over us, casting long shadows on the ground. There was something about the place that felt alive in a way I couldn't explain. It felt wrong, like it had been waiting for someone to step in. That's when we heard it. A loud bang echoed from somewhere deep inside the building. We all froze, our flashlights trembling in our hands. The noise sounded like something or someone had dropped something heavy. I could hear the others' breath quicken, their eyes wide with fear. "Did anyone else hear that?" Mike whispered. We all nodded. "Probably an animal," I suggested, but my voice didn't sound as sure as it should have. Still, none of us moved. We just stood there, waiting. The building seemed to close in around us, the air thickening with each passing second. Then suddenly we heard something else, soft, shuffling footsteps. They were slow, deliberate, as if something was walking toward us, but no one was in sight. "I don't think we're alone," Jess said, her voice shaking. "We need to leave. Now." Before any of us could respond, a loud crash came from the room behind us, followed by the unmistakable sound of scraping metal, like something was dragging itself across the floor. We turned around, but the room was empty. There was nothing there but old, broken equipment. "We need to get out. Now," I said, my voice low but firm. We all turned and bolted toward the exit. As we rushed through the hallways, the building seemed to shift around us, the walls narrowing, the shadows stretching, as though something was chasing us. We stumbled, our hearts racing, as we sprinted for the door we had come through. But just as we reached it, something heavy slammed into the door from the other side, blocking our escape. We screamed, banging on the door, trying to force it open, but it wouldn't budge. The air turned colder, and the whispers started, soft, unintelligible murmurs that came from all around us. We couldn't tell where they were coming from, but they filled the room like a chorus of voices. Panic set in. We had to get out, but the door wouldn't open. The whispers grew louder, and the scraping noise started again, closer this time. Something was moving in the dark, something that shouldn't be there. Suddenly, the door behind us creaked open, and a gust of wind rushed through the building, extinguishing our flashlights. We turned, heartbeats pounding, to see a figure standing in the doorway. It was a man, or at least, it looked like one. But his face was hollow, as if it had been sucked dry of life. His skin was ashen, and his eyes were black holes, empty of anything human. He didn't move, just stood there, watching us with those soulless eyes. His mouth stretched into a grin that sent a cold shiver through my spine. The whispers grew louder, and the air grew thick, almost suffocating. Before we could react, the figure reached out, its bony hand coming toward us, and the world around us seemed to tilt. We were no longer in the mill. We were somewhere else, somewhere dark and cold, a place that didn't feel like reality. And then, just as quickly as it had started, it stopped. We were back in the factory, gasping for air. The door was wide open, and the whispers had ceased. The figure was gone. We didn't need to say anything. We ran as fast as we could back to the car, never once looking back. As we sped away from the mill, the first light of dawn breaking over the horizon, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was still with us. It wasn't over. Whatever was in that mill, whatever had followed us, was still out there. The others didn't speak much on the way home, but I could see the fear in their eyes, and I knew that none of us would ever step foot in that building again. The mill still stands at the edge of town, its doors creaking in the wind, but none of us have gone back. Some places, once you enter them, never let you go. And that night, we found one of those places. Feeling spooky? Keep the chills coming by subscribing to our channel for more ghostly stories.
Next story.
It was a chilly October evening when my friends and I decided to check out the old house on the edge of town. We had heard rumors about it for years. Stories passed down from generation to generation. They said the house had been abandoned for decades, and it was haunted by the spirit of the woman who had once lived there. People claimed to have seen lights flickering in the windows at night, heard faint screams, and even felt a cold presence lurking in the shadows. But, as college students, we thought of these stories as nothing more than ghostly folklore. tales meant to spook the younger kids around Halloween. I remember exactly how the night started. We parked our cars at the end of the long, dirt road leading up to the house, and we all got out. The house stood there like a skeleton, its darkened windows staring down at us, the walls cracked and crumbling with age. The wind howled through the trees surrounding it, and the air smelled damp, like earth and decay. My friend Jake laughed nervously, suggesting we go in and see if we could find any evidence of ghosts to post online. We all agreed, mostly because we were too curious to turn back. The front door, surprisingly, was slightly ajar, as if it were inviting us in. I felt an odd sensation in the pit of my stomach as I stepped over the threshold, but I tried to ignore it. The floorboards creaked under our weight, echoing in the silence. The air inside was musty and thick, carrying the scent of old wood and something else, something metallic that I couldn't quite place. We flicked on our flashlights, casting long shadows on the cracked walls, revealing faded wallpaper that looked like it hadn't been touched in years. We split up to explore the house. Jake and Sarah headed toward the kitchen, while Mark and I made our way up the staircase. As we reached the top, the floor creaked loudly under our feet, and we both stopped in our tracks. The atmosphere here felt different, heavier. The air felt cold, colder than it had been outside, and the hairs on the back of my neck stood up. I could hear faint whispers, barely audible, like someone was speaking just beyond my hearing. I brushed it off as the wind, but Mark seemed to have noticed too. "Did you hear that?" he asked quietly, his voice trembling slightly. "I didn't hear anything," I said, trying to sound more confident than I felt. We continued down the hallway, our flashlights scanning the rooms. The floor was covered with dust, and the wallpaper peeled from the walls like old skin. There was a door at the end of the hall that caught my attention. It was slightly open, and behind it I could see a small room bathed in an eerie dim light. I couldn't explain it, but something about the room felt wrong. Before I could say anything, Mark walked ahead of me, pushing the door open. We stepped inside, and the temperature dropped even further. I shivered, my breath now visible in front of me. There was a large mirror on the far wall, its surface cracked and streaked with grime. But as I looked into it, I saw something that made my heart race. It wasn't just my reflection. Behind me, I could see a figure, a woman, pale and gaunt with hollow eyes and tattered clothes. She stood motionless, staring at me with an intense gaze. My blood ran cold. I spun around, but no one was there. I turned back to the mirror, and the woman was gone. I blinked, trying to shake the image from my mind, but I couldn't. Her eyes were burned into my memory. "What's wrong?" Mark asked, noticing my sudden stiff posture. "There's something in the mirror," I whispered, my voice barely audible. I couldn't bring myself to look again, but the image of the woman lingered in my mind, her cold stare haunting me. Suddenly, a loud bang echoed through the house. It came from downstairs, followed by the unmistakable sound of footsteps. We both froze, our eyes wide with fear. The footsteps grew louder, coming closer, as if someone or something was walking toward us. "Jake? Sarah?" I called out, my voice shaking. There was no response. Mark and I exchanged a look before we rushed down the stairs. The house felt even more oppressive now, the walls closing in as we descended. When we reached the bottom, I called out again, "Jake? Sarah?" Still, nothing. The house was dead silent, except for the sound of our own breathing and the distant creak of the floorboards. We headed into the living room, but there was no sign of them. My stomach twisted with anxiety. Something wasn't right. Suddenly, the door to the kitchen slammed shut on its own, causing us both to jump. We hesitated before moving toward it. I pushed it open, and there they were, Jake and Sarah, standing motionless, staring straight ahead with empty expressions on their faces. Their eyes were wide, unblinking, but they didn't acknowledge us. "Hey, what's going on?" I shouted, walking over to them. I waved my hand in front of Jake's face, but there was no response. It was like they were in some sort of trance. I reached out and touched Sarah's arm, and immediately a cold shock shot through my body. It felt like ice, like something frozen deep within her. But when I looked down, I saw her hand clutching something tightly. I tried to pry her fingers open, and when I did, my stomach dropped. It was a key, a rusted old key, covered in dirt. It looked ancient, like it belonged to the house itself. My hands trembled as I held it, and that's when I heard it. The whispering again, louder this time, coming from deep within the house. It was almost a chant, a rhythm, like someone was speaking in a language I didn't understand. My heart hammered in my chest. "What do you think it means?" Mark whispered, his voice barely audible. "I don't know," I replied, my mind racing. But deep down, I felt like we had just uncovered something we weren't supposed to find. That key, it felt wrong, like it had been waiting for someone to find it. Suddenly, the ground shook beneath our feet. The walls groaned as if the house itself was alive and angry. The lights flickered and the temperature dropped even further. The whispering grew louder, like almost deafening. I could feel it. Whatever it was getting closer. I turned to Mark. "We need to get out of here, now." But as we rushed for the door, it slammed shut in front of us with such force that it nearly knocked us to the ground. The house was alive, and it wasn't going to let us leave. The key in my hand seemed to pulse, vibrating with an energy I couldn't explain. I turned to Sarah and Jake, hoping they'd snap out of their trance, but they remained unmoving. That's when I saw it. A shadow creeping across the walls, moving in ways that no human being could. It was tall, unnaturally tall, and it had a presence that felt darker than anything I had ever experienced. It wasn't human. It wasn't even alive. Before I could scream, everything went black. When I woke up, I was outside the house. I don't remember how I got there or what happened after that moment. Mark was gone, and so were Jake and Sarah. I was alone. The house is still there, looming at the end of the road, but I haven't gone back. I don't know if I ever will, and every time I close my eyes, I can still hear the whispering calling me back. Enjoyed the story? Don't forget to subscribe and be a part of our haunting journey.
Next story.
It was late one autumn evening, and I had just finished my shift at the diner when my friends and I decided to take a little trip. We had heard about an old hospital on the edge of town, a place that had been abandoned for years. Everyone said it was haunted. No one had dared go inside for as long as anyone could remember, and naturally that made it the perfect place for us to explore. My friends joked about it, laughing about the ghosts they would prank me with, but deep down, I knew something didn't sit right with me. We didn't have a specific plan. We just wanted to sneak in, poke around, and prove that we weren't afraid. We parked outside the rusted gates that were once a grand entrance to the hospital grounds. The iron gates stood cracked and twisted, some parts completely broken. The place looked like it had been untouched for decades. I think the sight alone would have deterred most people, but not us. We were curious, reckless, and foolish. We walked across the overgrown yard, the dry grass crunching beneath our feet. The wind rustled through the trees, and the sky above was covered with dark clouds. There was a faint smell of decay in the air, but I couldn't tell whether it was from the building or the strange, lingering chill that seemed to hang over the place. The entrance door was hanging ajar, almost inviting us in. The interior was dim, barely lit by the flickering light coming from the cracked windows. The floor was covered in dust and debris, and the walls were lined with faded, peeling paint. The whole place looked like it hadn't seen a human footstep in years. "We should split up," my friend Jake said. "We'll cover more ground that way." I didn't like the idea. The place already felt wrong, but I didn't want to be the one to back out. So, reluctantly, I agreed. We all took different directions. Jake, Sarah, and Mike went off into the main wing, while I wandered toward the back of the building, feeling a strange pull toward the old, rusted elevator shaft. As I walked through the hallways, my footsteps echoing against the walls, I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. The silence in the building was unnerving, as if it was holding its breath, waiting for something. Every creak of the floorboards made my heart jump, and I found myself checking over my shoulder every few steps. I finally made my way to the back of the building where I found the old elevator. The rusted metal doors were slightly ajar, and inside I could see nothing but darkness. The elevator was stuck between floors, and there was a strange smell, like old blood. My stomach turned, but something compelled me to step closer. I leaned in to get a better look, and that's when I heard it. A soft, almost imperceptible sound from the far end of the hallway. Footsteps. Not the kind of footsteps I was making, but slow, deliberate ones, like someone was walking just behind me. I froze. The footsteps stopped. I turned quickly, but no one was there. I looked up and down the hallway, trying to make sense of it, but all I saw were shadows and dust. My heart raced, and I could feel my hands start to tremble. This wasn't normal. I took a step back, ready to leave the elevator shaft, when I felt something cold brush against my neck. It was a sensation like fingers lightly running across my skin. My breath caught in my throat as I whipped around, but again, there was nothing there. That's when I heard a voice, low and raspy, coming from somewhere behind me. "Get out!" I spun toward the sound of the voice, my pulse pounding in my ears, but there was no one there. The air was thick with an overwhelming sense of dread, and I knew, deep in my bones, that whatever was here, it didn't want us in this building. I couldn't move. I couldn't breathe. I felt like I was trapped in some kind of nightmare. Suddenly, the silence was broken by a loud crash from the other side of the building, louder than anything I'd heard so far. It was followed by screams. Mike's scream, Jake's yell. I didn't hesitate. I ran. I sprinted down the dark hallway, my feet pounding against the floor as I tried to find my friends. I didn't even look back. I just kept running, the sound of footsteps behind me growing louder, as though someone or something was chasing me. I reached the main wing where I had last seen them, but the hallway was empty. The rooms were dark and abandoned. The only thing that greeted me was the heavy air, thick with the feeling that something was wrong. "Jake, Mike, Sarah," I shouted, my voice echoing through the halls. No answer. I ran into the first room I could find, hoping to find my friends, but as I stepped inside, the door slammed shut behind me. I whipped around to find it locked, the handle shaking violently as if something on the other side was trying to get in. The room was small, its walls covered in old, cracked tiles. In the corner, I noticed an old hospital bed, its sheets torn and stained. But what caught my eye, what made my blood run cold, was the mirror on the far wall. It wasn't reflecting the room. Instead, the mirror showed a dark hallway, a hallway I hadn't seen before. But the strangest part? There was a figure standing at the far end of the hallway, just staring at me. It was a woman, her face pale and gaunt, her hair hanging in tangled strands around her face. Her eyes were wide, unblinking, and filled with an expression of pure terror. Then she moved. The figure in the mirror took a step forward, and I could see her mouth open as though she was trying to scream. But no sound came out. My heart raced as I backed away, my body pressed against the far wall of the room. The figure in the mirror continued to move toward me, her feet silent against the floor until she was standing just inches away from the glass. Then she opened her mouth wide, and I heard her voice, clear and chilling. "Get out now." Before I could react, the door burst open, and my friends rushed in. They were all pale, wide-eyed, and out of breath. "We need to leave," Jake said, grabbing my arm. "Now." Without a word, we turned and ran, not looking back, not even daring to stop. We didn't even care that we were trespassing. All we wanted was to get out of that place. We bolted out of the building, the cold night air hitting us like a slap in the face. We didn't speak as we piled into the car and sped away. None of us could explain what had happened, what we had seen, or what had followed us out. All I know is that when I looked back, the hospital seemed even darker than before, and I could swear I saw the faint outline of a figure watching us from the window on the top floor. I haven't been back to that place since. In fact, I don't think anyone has. We all went our separate ways after that night, but we still talk about it. The thing we all saw, the thing we all felt, it still haunts me, and every time I think about it, I hear that voice. That same voice that whispered in my ear, "Get out." Want more spine-chilling stories? Hit the subscribe button now.
Next story.
It was a chilly evening, and I had been driving down an empty stretch of highway for hours. The headlights of my car barely illuminated the winding road ahead, and the only sound I could hear was the hum of the engine. I had left my friends at a nearby town and was making my way to a relative's house across the state. I'd taken the long route, hoping to enjoy the solitude and peace of the country roads. But as the hours passed, the isolation started to feel overwhelming. I didn't plan to stop, but then there it was, an old, decrepit building standing just off the road, barely visible through the fog that had rolled in. It seemed out of place. There were no nearby homes, no shops, just this one ancient structure. The windows were broken, the door half open, and there was something unsettling about the way it stood in the silence. I should have kept driving. I know that now. But curiosity got the better of me, and I decided to stop, convinced I could snap a few pictures of the old building before heading on. I marked my car a little ways down the road, leaving the engine running. As I walked closer to the building, I could feel the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. Something wasn't right. The building was a two-story brick structure, weathered and crumbling with age. The paint was peeling off, revealing exposed brick that looked almost black in the dim light. The air smelled musty, like mildew and rot. As I pushed open the door, it creaked loudly, echoing through the empty space inside. The interior was just as abandoned and decayed as the outside. Dust coated everything, and broken furniture lay scattered across the floor, as if someone had left in a hurry, abandoning the place without a second thought. I stepped inside, my flashlight casting long shadows across the room. My shoes crunched on broken glass as I moved further in. The silence was unnerving. The kind of silence that feels like it's pressing in on you, like there's something waiting for you to make a sound. I scanned the room with my flashlight, the beam cutting through the gloom. There was nothing remarkable at first glance, just old furniture, shattered windows, and piles of debris. But then I noticed something strange, an old painting hanging crookedly on the far wall. It was a portrait of a woman, her face obscured by years of grime, but her eyes, despite the decay, were sharp and cold, staring directly at me. I took a step back, unnerved by the intense gaze of the woman in the painting. Something about her expression felt wrong, as if she knew I didn't belong there. The longer I stood there, the more I felt an uncomfortable pressure in the air, like something was watching me. I tried to shake it off, telling myself it was just my imagination. But as I turned to leave, something caught my eye in the corner of the room. A door. It was half hidden by the shadows, as though it had been deliberately forgotten or ignored. The wood was rotting and the handle was rusted, but it seemed like a door that had been waiting for someone to open it. Against my better judgment, I walked over and turned the handle. The door groaned as it opened, revealing a narrow staircase that led down into darkness. I hesitated. My heart was pounding in my chest, and every instinct in my body screamed at me to leave, but curiosity won out again. I descended the steps slowly, trying not to make a sound. As I reached the bottom, the air grew colder, and I could almost taste the dampness in the air. The basement smelled like old earth and decay. I turned on my flashlight, sweeping the beam across the room. The walls were covered in mold, and old wooden crates were stacked haphazardly in the corners. But the most disturbing thing I saw was the old rocking chair in the center of the room. It was rocking slowly back and forth, as though someone had just been sitting in it. I froze. My breath caught in my throat. No one else was here. I had been alone in the building. The rocking chair shouldn't have been moving. My mind raced, trying to rationalize what I was seeing. Maybe it was the wind. Maybe the building was so old that the chair moved on its own. But deep down, I knew that wasn't the answer. I stepped closer to the chair, my heartbeat echoing in my ears. As I reached out to stop it, the flashlight flickered. For a moment, everything went black. I cursed under my breath and smacked the flashlight, willing it to turn back on. When the light finally came back, the chair was no longer rocking. But that wasn't the worst part. Standing in front of the chair was a figure. A woman. She was dressed in a long, faded gown, her hair matted and tangled. Her face was obscured, but there was something about her posture that made it clear she was aware of my presence. I wanted to scream, but the words stuck in my throat. My feet felt frozen in place, as if my body was betraying me, refusing to move. The woman didn't say a word. She didn't need to. Her presence was enough to send waves of dread through my entire body. I tried to step back, but I felt as though the air itself had thickened, trapping me in place. The woman's head tilted slowly, and I could feel her gaze, even though I couldn't see her eyes. It was like she was looking straight into my soul, and I felt something. A pressure, an overwhelming sensation, like she was pulling me toward her. I shook my head, telling myself I had to leave, that I needed to escape. But before I could move, the ground beneath me shifted and I stumbled, falling to my knees. The woman didn't move. She was still standing there, as still as a statue. The air grew colder and the shadows seemed to stretch longer. Then I heard it, a whisper. It was faint at first, barely audible, But then it grew louder, and I could hear the words clearly. Leave. Now. I scrambled to my feet, panic rising in my chest. I knew I had to get out of there. I turned and ran up the stairs, my breath coming in ragged gasps. The door at the top of the stairs slammed shut behind me with a deafening bang, and I nearly tripped over my own feet as I tried to escape the basement. I didn't stop running until I was back in my car. My hands were shaking as I fumbled with the keys, and it felt like I was suffocating as the door slammed shut behind me. I turned the key and sped off, not daring to look back. But the whispers followed me. As I drove away, I could hear them. Faint, soft, but unmistakable. It was as if the woman was still there, watching me, following me. I don't know what happened in that building or why it was there, but I can't forget it. Sometimes when I close my eyes at night, I can still hear the whispers, and I can still feel the weight of her gaze, even though I know I'll never go back there again. Enjoyed this story? Make sure to subscribe for your next terrifying tale.
Next story.
I had always heard stories about abandoned buildings and their haunted reputations, but I never gave them much thought. I mean, who really believes in that kind of thing, right? At least that's what I used to think. My view on the matter completely changed after a night I will never forget. It all started when my friends and I, during a summer break from college, decided to go exploring. There was this old abandoned asylum just outside town. It had been closed for decades, and stories about it were rampant. Some said it was haunted by the souls of patients who had been mistreated there. Others said it was cursed. We were skeptical, of course, but we also had nothing else to do, and the idea of exploring an abandoned building was too intriguing to pass up. We arrived there just after sundown, the sky turning that deep purple-blue color that only comes before full darkness sets in. The asylum loomed in front of us, massive and imposing, with shattered windows and ivy creeping up its crumbling stone walls. It looked like something straight out of a horror movie. But we weren't scared, at least not yet. The rusted gate creaked as we pushed it open, stepping into the overgrown yard. We could hear the distant rustling of trees and the occasional scurry of small animals in the underbrush. My heart was pounding, but it was more out of excitement than fear. The building had this eerie silence about it, but it was a silence that felt more foreboding the closer we got. As we approached the main entrance, I noticed the front door was ajar. That was strange. No one had been here for years, yet it seemed like someone, or something, had been through recently. I turned to my friends, trying to make light of the situation. I guess the ghosts are already expecting us, I joked, but my voice cracked a little. The air around me seemed colder than it had been just moments before. We stepped inside, and I immediately felt a chill run down my spine. The hallway stretched ahead of us, the floorboards creaking with every step. The walls were stained, peeling with age, and the smell of mildew filled the air. We started making our way down the corridor, the sound of our footsteps the only thing breaking the silence. I tried to focus on the adventure, to keep my mind from wandering to the stories I had heard about this place. But the further we went, the more uneasy I became. There were strange marks on the walls, scratches like something had tried to claw its way out. The faint sound of whispering filled the air, but when I stopped and listened closely, I realized it was just the wind making its way through the cracks in the walls. At least I tried to tell myself that. We came to a large room, a former dining hall or lounge area, perhaps. The windows were shattered, the furniture overturned and decayed. The place had been left to rot, but it still felt like it was alive in some strange way. I could almost feel eyes on me, though I couldn't see anyone. My heart was racing now, my breath shallow. Something wasn't right. I could feel it deep in my gut, but I didn't want to admit it. I didn't want to seem scared in front of my friends. Then, without warning, one of the old doors slammed shut. We all jumped, and I swore I heard something moving behind it. My friend Sarah laughed nervously, trying to brush it off as the wind. But when I looked at her, her face was pale, her eyes wide with fear. "I think we should leave," she whispered. I nodded, agreeing with her for once. But as we turned to leave, the hallway seemed longer. The exit felt farther away than it had before. The whispering grew louder, and the temperature dropped. My breath came out in visible puffs now, even though it had been a warm evening outside. We rushed back toward the entrance, but the door we had come in through was now shut. We tried to push it open, but it was as if something was holding it shut from the other side. Panic started to set in. We banged on the door, shouting for help, but no one was around. I could feel the walls closing in, the pressure building with every second. That's when I heard it. A faint, rasping voice calling my name. Sarah. I turned around, but no one was behind me. My heart stopped. The whisper came again, this time much closer. Sarah. It was a cold, grating voice, like someone trying to speak through a mouthful of gravel. I froze, unable to move. My friends were calling out for me, asking what was wrong, but I couldn't respond. My eyes were locked on the hallway ahead of me. And then, I saw it. A figure, pale and gaunt, was standing at the far end of the corridor. It was barely a shape, more like a shadow that didn't belong. Its limbs were unnaturally long, and its face, oh God, its face, was a mess of scars and twisted features. It was like nothing human, but something worse. It stood perfectly still, watching us. Sarah, let's go! Now! My friend Mark yelled, shaking me from my trance. I snapped out of it, and we all turned and ran toward the door, slamming into it over and over again. The air was thick now, suffocating, and I felt like I couldn't get enough breath. Then, as if by some miracle, the door opened. We bolted out into the night, gasping for air, our hearts pounding in our chests. The asylum behind us was silent once more. We didn't look back as we ran to the car, speeding away from that place as fast as we could. But the entire ride home, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was following us. A presence that wasn't just in that building, but something that had come with us. I kept glancing in the rearview mirror, expecting to see that figure. But there was nothing. When I finally got home, I locked the doors and windows, pulled the covers over my head, and tried to convince myself that it was just an overactive imagination. But the next morning, I woke up with strange scratches on my arms, long, thin marks that hadn't been there the night before. My heart sank as I looked at them. I knew something had followed us. Something from that building. And no matter how much I tried to forget, it was still there, lurking, waiting for its next chance. The building is still there, decaying slowly as if it's biding its time. I've heard rumors that people still go there, but none of them ever return the same. Maybe they're braver than I am, or maybe they've been taken by whatever haunts that place. I don't know. All I know is that I won't be going back. And if you ever get the urge to explore an abandoned building, my advice is simple. Don't. Some things are better left alone, and some doors, once open, should never be closed again. Don't miss out on more hauntingly good stories. Subscribe now.
Next story.
It was supposed to be a simple late-night adventure. Just a group of us getting together, driving out of town, and checking out a place that had been abandoned for years. Nothing too extraordinary. But what we found that night turned out to be far from ordinary, and what I experienced would change my life forever. I had always been the skeptic, the one who'd laugh at ghost stories and dismiss creepy rumors. But my friend Danny, who was the complete opposite of me, insisted that we check out a place called Hollow Creek Manor. It was an old grand house sitting on a plot of land about 15 miles outside of town. The kind of house you'd see in an old black and white movie, all creaky floorboards and large, empty rooms filled with cobwebs. It had been empty for over 40 years after the last owner disappeared without a trace, and the place had been left to rot ever since. You don't believe in ghosts, do you? Danny teased as we piled into the car that evening. I'll bet you $10 you'll be running out of there faster than you can blink when you see something. Not happening, I replied with a grin, leaning back in my seat. But if I do, I want double the bet. We laughed, but deep down, I wasn't thrilled about this trip. I had always been unnerved by old houses, especially the ones with no history. The kind of places that were abandoned, left behind by someone who either fled or vanished. The drive was uneventful until we turned down a narrow, tree-lined road. The house was barely visible at first, just a dark shape in the distance. But as we got closer, it loomed over us, towering and oppressive. The windows were black and empty, the porch sagging as though it might collapse any minute. We parked a little ways down the road and began walking toward it, the crunch of our shoes against the gravel the only sound that seemed to break the eerie silence. We approached the front door, which stood wide open. No one had been there in years, but the door had been left ajar like someone was waiting for us. Or maybe something was. We'll just take a quick look around, Danny said, his voice cutting through the silence. No harm in that. We stepped inside, and the air hit me like a wall. A dense, musty, almost moldy air that made my stomach churn. It felt like the house had been holding its breath for years, waiting for someone to break the stillness. I flicked on my flashlight, and the beam caught the walls, revealing faded wallpaper and chipped furniture. The place had a hollow feel, like it wasn't just abandoned. It had been forgotten. We split up to explore the place. Danny and our friend Clara went upstairs while I stayed on the first floor with Jason, poking around in the living room and dining area. Everything was coated in dust, but I noticed that in certain places the dust seemed disturbed, like someone had been here more recently than they should have. I brushed it off, thinking it was probably just the wind or small animals. But then I heard something, a faint thud, followed by a dragging sound coming from upstairs. "Did you hear that?" Jason whispered, his face going pale. I nodded, but I didn't say anything. It was just the house settling, I told myself, just the creaks of an old building. But deep down, I felt the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. "Let's check it out," Jason suggested, his voice barely above a whisper. We crept up the stairs, the floorboards groaning beneath us. The hallway upstairs was even darker than below, the shadows swallowing up everything that didn't catch the weak beam of my flashlight. We reached the end of the hall, where two doors stood open. The sound was coming from one of them. We walked inside cautiously, and the first thing I noticed was the smell. It was faint, but it wasn't like anything I had ever smelled before. It wasn't mold or decay, it was something sharper, almost metallic. It didn't take long to realize the source. The room was full of old furniture, but the walls were covered with dark stains, like someone had been there and tried to wash them away. But they hadn't been cleaned in years. Before I could say anything, the dragging sound came again, closer this time. I froze. It wasn't just a sound anymore. It felt like something was moving in the room with us. Jason grabbed my arm and I turned to face him. His eyes were wide with fear. "We need to leave now," he whispered urgently. We backed away from the room, but before we could make it back to the stairs, the door slammed shut behind us, trapping us inside. I rushed for the door, but it wouldn't budge. The room was cold now, unbearably cold. I could see my breath in the air. "Help! Danny! Clara!" I screamed, but my voice sounded strange, as if it was muffled, even though I was shouting at the top of my lungs. I heard the sound again, closer now, and when I turned, my flashlight caught something moving in the corner of the room. It was a shape, but it wasn't human. It was tall, too tall for any person, with thin, spindly limbs and a face that looked like it had been carved from stone. Its eyes black as coal, its mouth open in a scream, but no sound coming out. My heart skipped a beat. I couldn't breathe. I couldn't move. And then, in the blink of an eye, the figure lunged toward me. I screamed and tried to back away, but my legs wouldn't work. I stumbled, falling backward onto the floor, my flashlight rolling across the room, its beam now pointing at the wall. And just like that, the figure disappeared. I was shaking, my body cold and clammy with sweat, my mind reeling. Jason was no better. He was on his hands and knees, gasping for air. I managed to get to my feet, my hands shaking as I reached for the door again. This time, it opened. I rushed out of the room and into the hallway, and we ran down the stairs, our footsteps pounding as we tried to get away. I don't know how we got out of that house, but we did. Danny and Clara were waiting for us outside, looking just as terrified as we felt. We didn't say much to each other as we got back in the car. No one spoke for the entire drive home, and when I looked out the window, I could have sworn I saw a figure standing in the doorway of Hollow Creek Manor, watching us leave. We never went back to that house. In fact, none of us have ever spoken about it again, not in detail. But every once in a while, when I'm alone at night and the air is still, I can feel it. Feel that same cold, oppressive presence that we encountered that night. It's like something is still following me, waiting, and I don't know if I'll ever be free of it. Get ready for more spooky stories. Don't forget to subscribe.
Next story.
I never believed in ghosts. I used to laugh at the idea of haunted places, chalking it all up to superstition and imagination. But what happened to me that night shattered that disbelief completely. It started like any other evening. I was working late at my office, one of the few left in the building after hours. The company I worked for was on the top floor of a tall, old building in the heart of the city. The building was one of those relics from a bygone era. Its architecture a mix of Gothic revival with a little Art Deco thrown in for good measure. People said it was built in the early 1900s, and while it was renovated over the years, you could still feel its age when you walked in. The marble floors were scuffed, the elevators slow, and the staircases creaked underfoot. By the time I finished the last of my work and looked at the clock, it was almost 11:30 p.m. The office was empty, the hum of the fluorescent lights above me the only sound. I had planned to leave sooner, but a few last-minute reports had kept me busy. I didn't mind the solitude, though. I was used to it. Most of my coworkers had long since left, and I enjoyed the peace of the quiet, empty space. I packed up my things and headed to the elevator, the silence around me beginning to feel oppressive. The old elevator creaked as it descended, and when the doors finally opened to the ground floor, I was hit with an unexpected chill. The building was eerily quiet, and I had to admit, there was something unsettling about being the last one in the building. As I stepped out of the elevator, I glanced around. The lights in the lobby were dim, casting long shadows across the floor. I could see the exit doors at the far end of the room, the streetlights outside casting an orange glow through the glass. For a second, I thought I heard a noise like footsteps echoing in the hallway behind me. But when I turned around, no one was there. I shrugged it off, just the building settling, I told myself. The doors to the exit were locked, which was normal for the late hours. I fumbled with my keys, trying to find the right one, but then something strange happened. I heard the faint sound of a door opening behind me. My heart skipped a beat. I didn't remember hearing any footsteps, but when I turned around, the door to the stairwell was wide open. I hesitated. It didn't make sense. I hadn't seen anyone else on the floor, and the stairwell was supposed to be locked after hours. I glanced back at the elevator. It was just me. No one else had been around. I walked cautiously toward the stairwell, the flickering lights above me casting an uneven glow over the darkened space. My steps were slow, deliberate, but the sense of unease grew heavier with every passing second. Then a sound, a whisper. It was faint but unmistakable. It seemed to come from the stairwell, low and murmuring. I stopped dead in my tracks, my breath catching in my throat. Was it just the wind? Maybe the building's pipes? I told myself I was being paranoid, but the whispering persisted, growing louder, clearer. Help me. The voice was faint, desperate, like someone in pain. I stood frozen, my mind racing. I couldn't move. I didn't know what to do. Was someone still in the building? A prank? No, it didn't feel like that. It felt wrong. Like the voice wasn't just asking for help. It was demanding it. Instinct took over. I wasn't about to just ignore this. I couldn't explain why, but I had to check it out. I approached the door slowly, and as I reached out to push it open, the temperature dropped noticeably. The air was thick with a strange energy, and the closer I got, the more the feeling of dread gnawed at me. I pushed the door open, and a gust of cold air hit me, as if the stairwell itself was exhaling, or breathing. The stairwell was dimly lit, the steps covered in years of grime and dust, but it wasn't the state of the stairwell that made my skin crawl. It was what I could feel. Something was there. A presence. Something. Wrong. Help me. The voice came again, louder this time, echoing off the walls like a scream trapped in the very air. I stumbled backward, a chill running through my entire body, and then I saw it. A shadow. It was a dark shape standing at the top of the stairwell, but it wasn't a person. It was something else. It seemed to writhe and stretch, its edges flickering like a flame, but there was no heat. The longer I looked at it, the more distorted it became, almost as if it didn't belong in the physical world at all. It wasn't just the shape of it that terrified me, it was the feeling that came with it, a sensation of emptiness, of despair. I could almost hear the anguish radiating from it. I don't know how long I stood there, paralyzed by fear, but at some point, the voice spoke again, louder, sharper. Leave now, or I'll take you too. Something snapped inside me. I turned and ran. I don't know how I made it to the exit door, but I did, slamming it open as I burst into the cold night air. My heart was racing, my breaths coming in sharp gasps. I didn't dare look back, not even once, afraid of what I might see. I never went back to that building. The next day, I tried to search for any mention of strange occurrences, anything about the stairwell or that presence, but I found nothing. No one I talked to knew anything about it. The building, though old, was still in use, and there were no reports of anything out of the ordinary. But I knew what I felt, what I heard. I wasn't the first person to experience it. To this day, I can't explain what happened. Was it a ghost, an entity, or was it something else entirely, something I wasn't meant to understand? But I'll tell you one thing. I've never doubted the existence of the supernatural again. Whatever that thing was in that building, it was real. And it still haunts me to this day. Are you hooked on these spine-tingling stories? Subscribe to get more and never miss a scary moment.
Next story.
It was just past midnight when I took the wrong turn. My phone's GPS had gone haywire, and I found myself winding down an unfamiliar road surrounded by trees and fog. I had been driving for hours, hoping to make it back to my hotel, but now I was lost in a stretch of rural land that seemed as empty as it was quiet. I thought about stopping, but there was no sign of civilization. No lights in the distance, no cars on the road. Just darkness. So I pressed on, hoping to find a turnoff or a gas station soon. That's when I saw it. In the distance, through the haze of fog, there was a building. It looked like an old farmhouse, though it was too far away for me to make out the details. Something about it, though, caught my attention. The lights flickered, faint but noticeable. I figured it was my chance to ask for directions, so I decided to make my way over. The road leading up to the house was narrow, surrounded by overgrown grass and twisted trees. My headlights barely cut through the darkness, but I saw enough to make me feel uneasy. The building stood by itself, isolated from anything else, its windows dark and its porch sagging under years of neglect. A weathered sign hung loosely from the porch, the letters almost indecipherable from a distance, but something about it felt strange. As I pulled up to the house, the engine hummed quietly. I glanced at the sign again. Winterford House. That's all it said. There was no other indication of what the place was or why it was even there. But something about the name gave me chills, as if I'd heard it before, though I couldn't place it. I parked in front of the house and got out of the car, the cool night air hitting me immediately. The silence was overwhelming, too quiet for comfort. No crickets, no wind, just stillness. I walked up to the porch. The door was ajar and hanging slightly off its hinges. I knocked, but there was no answer. I knocked again, a little louder this time. The door creaked open, and I hesitated. Should I step inside? Was it abandoned? Without much choice, I pushed the door open further. A musty, earthy smell hit me, mixed with the sharp tang of something old and decayed. I stepped inside, my shoes scraping against the wooden floor as I walked further in. The house was eerily still, not a soul in sight. The furniture was old, covered in sheets, as though it hadn't been touched in years. I took a few more steps, moving deeper into the house. My flashlight illuminated the walls, revealing faded wallpaper, cracked windows, and what looked like the remnants of a long-abandoned home. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching me. Every step I took, I felt as though I was being drawn in, deeper into the house's heart. I turned a corner into a small hallway and froze. At the far end of the hallway was a door, half open. Beyond the door, I could make out a faint light, a dim glow that seemed to pulse in the air. My heart pounded as I approached, my mind racing. When I pushed the door open, I immediately regretted it. Inside was an old dining room. At the center of the room, there was a long wooden table covered in dust and cobwebs. But that wasn't what caught my attention. What stood at the end of the table was a tall, black figure, hunched over, its head bent down low. I couldn't see its face, but I could feel its presence, like it was waiting for me. I stood frozen in place, my breath catching in my throat. The figure remained motionless. I felt compelled to move closer, as if some unseen force was drawing me forward. I couldn't explain it, but my body took a step without my consent. I wanted to stop, to turn around, but something inside me pushed me forward. Then, it happened. The figure's head snapped up, and I could feel its eyes on me, even though I couldn't see them. A sharp, sudden cold shot through the room. I stumbled back, and the door slammed shut behind me with a deafening bang. My pulse raced, and I rushed to the door, fumbling with the handle, desperate to get out, but it wouldn't budge. From behind me, I heard the floorboards creak. I spun around to see the figure had moved. It was closer now, standing at the far end of the table. Its shape was more defined now, darker, like a silhouette made of shadow itself. I couldn't breathe. I felt paralyzed. Then the figure spoke in a voice that was barely a whisper, yet it seemed to reverberate in my bones. "Why did you come here?" The words sent a shockwave of terror through me, and I could feel my heart thudding in my chest. My mind screamed for me to run, but my legs wouldn't move. I could only stand there, frozen, as the figure took another step toward me. "Leave," it whispered again, this time louder, more insistent. Suddenly, the door to the room burst open. A cold wind rushed through, and I saw the figure flinch. For a brief moment, the shadow wavered as if it was being pushed back by an unseen force. Without thinking, I ran for the open door. I ran down the hallway, my footsteps echoing in the silence, and I didn't stop until I was outside. The cold air hit me like a slap in the face, and I gasped for breath. The house loomed behind me, but I didn't dare look back. I didn't wait to see if the figure followed. I jumped into my car and sped away, the engine roaring to life beneath me. As I drove, I glanced in the rearview mirror, half expecting to see the figure standing in the window, watching me leave. But there was nothing, just the empty road and the night stretching out ahead. As I made my way back to the main road, I realized something chilling. I had never heard of Winterford House before, and I couldn't find it on any map. It was as if it hadn't existed at all until I stumbled upon it. I never found my way back to that road again, and to this day I still don't know who or what was in that house. But every so often I hear whispers in the dark, as though someone's waiting, watching, waiting for the next person to wander off the road. Don't let these tales of terror end here. Subscribe for more and join our haunted family.
Next story.
I had always thought that the idea of haunted houses was just that, an idea. Something you read about in novels or watched in movies. The eerie creaking, the flickering lights, the whispers in the dark. They were just clever tricks of the mind, a way for people to indulge their fear of the unknown. At least, that's what I thought until I found myself in the old cabin in the woods. It all started when I decided to go on a solo hiking trip. I had been feeling overwhelmed with work and the demands of city life. I needed to disconnect to find some peace in the quiet of nature. After a few hours of driving, I found myself in a remote area, miles away from civilization. I had planned my route carefully, ensuring I'd be surrounded by beautiful scenery and solitude for the next few days. That's when I came across the cabin. It wasn't on my map, it wasn't marked as a point of interest, and there was no sign to indicate what it was. It was just there, nestled at the edge of the forest, as though it had been waiting for someone to find it. I approached cautiously, unsure whether I should continue or turn back. Something about the place felt off, but the allure of a shelter for the night pulled me in. The sun was beginning to set, and the temperature was dropping rapidly. I figured I could camp outside, but the thought of a warm bed made me reconsider. I made my way up the weathered steps and knocked on the door. No one answered, but it wasn't locked, so I let myself in. The door creaked open, revealing a dim, musty interior. The air was thick with the smell of rot and age, the walls covered in peeling wallpaper. The floorboards groaned under my weight as I stepped further inside. There was a fireplace on the far wall, the remnants of old ashes scattered across the hearth. It looked as though no one had been here in years. I stood there for a moment, considering my options. It didn't feel completely right, but the temptation of warmth won out. I set up my sleeping bag in the corner, next to the hearth, and began unpacking my gear. The whole time, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching me, lurking just out of sight. Night fell quickly. As I sat there trying to eat a small meal, I heard something. A sound, faint at first, like a whisper carried by the wind. I froze, straining to hear. There it was again, this time clearer. A soft voice, a gentle murmuring, as if someone was speaking just outside the cabin. But there was no one there. I was completely alone. I tried to convince myself it was just the wind, the trees shifting, or perhaps an animal in the woods. But something about the voice sent a chill down my spine. I sat still for a long while, waiting for it to stop. But it didn't. The whispering continued, growing louder. And then it stopped, abruptly, as if someone had cut it off. That's when I heard it, the sound of footsteps in the cabin. I looked around frantically, heart pounding in my chest. The footsteps were slow, deliberate, and they came from the back of the cabin near the stairs that led to the attic. I swallowed hard. There was no one else here. I was certain of it. But the footsteps kept getting closer until they were right outside the room where I sat. I stood up slowly, backing away toward the door. My breath was shallow, and my hands were shaking. There was no reason for anyone to be here. No one had passed me on the trail, and I hadn't heard a car for miles. But the steps didn't stop. They grew louder, faster, almost as though something was running toward me. Without thinking, I bolted for the door, throwing it open and stumbling outside into the cold night. I didn't even bother grabbing my pack or equipment. I just ran. The whispering started again, but now it was louder, more frantic, as though whatever was in the cabin was calling out to me, trying to reach me. I don't know how long I ran for, but eventually I found myself at a clearing, breathless and terrified. The whispering faded, and the forest around me felt eerily still. It was as though I had left whatever had been haunting the cabin behind. I didn't stop to look back. The rest of the night was a blur. I ended up camping out under the stars, too scared to go back to the cabin, and too exhausted to keep running. By morning, I made my way back to my car, avoiding the area where I had found the cabin. When I got home, I did some research, thinking maybe there was some rational explanation for what happened. But when I searched for any records of the cabin or the area, there was nothing. No mention of it on any hiking forums, no maps that marked it as a point of interest, no history. It was as if the cabin had never existed. I'm not sure what happened that night, and I don't want to know. All I know is that I will never, ever go back to that forest again. And whenever I hear someone mention haunted places or ghost stories, I can't help but remember the whispering, the footsteps, and the unmistakable feeling that whatever was in that cabin wasn't of this world. Feeling spooked? Subscribe for more terrifying tales that will send chills down your spine.